man stood at the edge of a cliff in 1911. Below him, nothing but air, and the long drop to the rocks. Behind him, 35 years of absolute certainty that he had been right about everything. He said 3 words. Then he stepped back. The question he left behind has never been answered. Tonight, friend, you have found Mr. K. Law. This is the quiet broadcast where the great characters of our time are remembered slowly and remembered fully. I am the keeper of their stories. You are the listener who does not need them to hurry. Before we begin, leave a thought below. Was Dutch van der Linde always the man he became? Or did something in this world break him along the way? And if you would like to find me again, the subscribe button is there. The light is low, the night is long, and the story is ready. Dutch, later known as the man with a plan, father of the van der Linde gang, last ghost of the dying American frontier, the man who could talk anyone into anything and who eventually talked himself into ruin. There is a question that sits at the center of everything I am going to tell you tonight. It is not a simple question. It does not have a clean answer. And I want to be honest with you from the very beginning. I am not going to give you one. What I am going to give you is the evidence, every piece of it that I could find, laid out in the order that feels most honest. And by the end of this long night, if the question is still open, and I believe it will be, then at least it will be a richer question than it was when we began. The question is this: was Dutch van der Linde always the man who shot Heidi McCourt in the head on a river dock in Blackwater in April of 1899? Was he always the man who watched Molly O'Shea be executed without lifting a single word in her defense? Was he always the man who used a young Wapiti man's grief as a weapon, who walked away from a dying Arthur Morgan on a mountainside, who stepped backward off a cliff at Cochinay in 1911 and called it a paradox? Or was there, before all of that, a different man entirely? A man who found orphan children on roadsides and taught them to read, who scolded his own enforcer for stealing from the poor, who read aloud from Evelyn Miller and Ralph Waldo Emerson by firelight to 2 boys who barely understood the words, but who listened anyway, because the voice reading them made the world feel less dangerous than it was. The record suggests both men existed. The record does not tell us when one became the other. That is the question we will carry tonight, through every robbery, every campfire, every moment of genuine warmth, and every act of cold destruction, all the way to the edge of that cliff in the Tall Trees Mountains, where a man in a faded orange shirt looked at his foreman, said 3 words and chose the only ending he could still control. We begin, as all honest investigations must, at the beginning. Somewhere outside Philadelphia, in the mid-1850s, a child was born to a woman named Greta, and a man whose first name the record has not preserved. What we know of the father is limited, but significant. He was Dutch by descent, the surname van der Linde carrying that northern European lineage into the Pennsylvania flatlands, into a household that was working class in the way the 19th century understood that phrase, which is to say without comfort, without safety, and without the particular luxury of imagining that things might become easier. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a prominent one. He was the kind of man the century produced in abundance and forgot with equal abundance. A man who worked, who lived, who existed in the specific American way of existing that left no monument and asked for none. The boy inherited his father's nickname rather than his given name, Dutch. It came from the blood, from the van der Linde line that stretched back to whatever town or province or flat northern landscape his grandfather had left behind to come to this country, looking for something that countries always promise and rarely deliver. The legal first name, if one was ever given, if it was ever recorded in any ledger or parish document, does not survive in anything I have been able to find. He was Dutch from the beginning. It was the one inheritance that lasted. The father was conscripted into the Union Army during the Civil War. He was not a volunteer. That distinction matters. He did not choose the war. The war chose him, in the mechanical way that wars choose ordinary men. through the machinery of conscription, through the government's need for bodies to feed into a conflict that was consuming them faster than ideology alone could supply. He went because the government required him to go. He died because the battlefield returned nothing that it took. The boy was very young when it happened, young enough that the death registered not as a specific grief with a specific shape, but as a permanent condition, a father-shaped absence that would become, over the years, a father-shaped wound, and eventually, in Dutch van der Linde's particular case, a father-shaped argument against everything the government that killed him stood for. This is the first piece of evidence I want you to hold. Not dramatic evidence, not the kind that resolves anything on its own. But note it carefully. A boy whose father was taken by the federal government and not returned. A boy raised in the knowledge that the machinery of the state had consumed his family and offered nothing in exchange. The men who become the most absolute enemies of systems are, very often, the men the systems have already consumed. Dutch van der Linde did not invent his hatred of government from nothing. It was given to him before he was old enough to examine it. Note it, we will return to it. Greta van der Linde raised the boy alone in the years after the war. What kind of woman she was, her temperament, her beliefs, whether she was warm or sharp or somewhere in the worn middle that poverty tends to produce in people who did not choose poverty but were assigned it. The record does not say clearly. She is a figure at the edge of the story rather than inside, present in the way that mothers are present in the early chapters of their sons' lives, before the sons become the story themselves. What the record does say is that Dutch left her when he was 15 years old. 15, the age at which most boys are still uncertain of most things, still learning the dimensions of the world they inhabit, still operating largely on instinct and borrowed confidence. Dutch van der Linde, at 15 years of age, walked out of whatever house or rented room or borrowed space he and Greta occupied on the outskirts of Philadelphia, and he did not go back. He would learn of her death a month later. Not from her. She was already gone by the time the news reached him. From an uncle, some unnamed relative, who tracked him down through whatever rough channels existed for finding a 15-year-old who had dissolved into the American road. The message arriving into hands that were already becoming someone else's hands entirely. A boy already in the process of becoming a different person, receiving news that the person he had left behind was no longer there to return to, even if he had wanted to. What passed between Dutch and that news? Whether he grieved, whether he had already grieved the living woman before she died, whether he felt guilt or relief, or some combination of things that a 15-year-old in 1870 has no language for, is not recorded. What is recorded, or rather what is observable from everything that followed, is that he did not go back. He did not seek out the uncle. He did not attempt to recover whatever small material inheritance might have existed. He went further out, further from the city, further from the government, further from the settled world that had produced the house with the absent father and the mother who died, while her son was already gone. This is the second piece of evidence. A boy who left before he was old enough to stay, who learned his mother was dead from a stranger's word and kept walking. Does that speak to damage, to some coldness already forming in him, or to a resilience that had no other direction to move in? The record does not adjudicate. I only report what I have described. The years between 15 and the mid-1870s are the years the record is thinnest. We know that Dutch van der Linde survived them. We know he did not survive them cleanly. He stole. He ran small cons. He moved through the Western territories learning the particular curriculum that the road offers to young men with intelligence and no resources. How to read a person faster than they can read you. How to identify the exact moment a situation turns dangerous. How to speak in whatever register the room requires. How to make a stranger trust you in the time it takes to cross a street. He was not, by the accounts that survived these years, brutal in the way he would later become. Not yet violent in the way that left bodies. The crimes were small. Theft, misdirection, the confidence trick in its simpler forms. the kind of crimes that require more cleverness than cruelty. And there is something in that detail worth sitting with for a moment. Dutch van der Linde was, by every consistent account of the man, at the height of his influence, extraordinarily intelligent, not educated in any formal sense, no schools, no university, no institutional shaping of whatever raw intelligence he was born with, but the kind of intelligence that is perhaps harder to manufacture than the schooled kind, the intelligence that reads rooms and reads people, that hears what is not being said, that identifies, in any gathering, who holds real power and who only holds the appearance of it. He developed this intelligence on the road, in the school that has no name and issues no certificate. He also read. This detail is confirmed by everything that came later, by the books found in his tent, by the passages he quoted, by the philosophy that structured his entire worldview. He read whatever he could find in those years. Philosophy when he could get it. Political theory. The writers who were asking, in the 1860s and 70s, the same questions Dutch was living rather than reading. What is freedom, actually? What does a man owe a government that has taken from him and returned nothing? What does civilization mean when it is constructed on the exclusion of everyone it claims to protect? These were not abstract questions for Dutch van der Linde. They were biographical ones, and he was finding, in the books he carried from town to town, thinkers who gave language to something he had been carrying since he was 15 on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Writers who said, the institutions you distrust are worthy of your distrust. The anger you feel is not madness. The world you were given is not the only possible world. He was building a theory, not yet a plan. The plan would come later, and later still it would become an obsession, and later still it would become a lie. He told himself so many times that he could no longer identify as a lie. But the theory came first, and in the 1870s, on the road, in the camps and the towns and the long distances between them, the theory was still forming, still carrying, somewhere inside it, the genuine question. What would a better world actually look like? Somewhere on the road to Chicago, in the mid-1870s, Dutch van der Linde met a man named Hosea Matthews. The circumstances of this meeting are, by any reasonable standard, absurd. Both men were attempting to rob the other simultaneously. Dutch had identified Hosea as a mark. Hosea had identified Dutch as a mark. They both moved. They both discovered what the other was doing at roughly the same moment, and they both started laughing. I have thought about that campfire more than almost anything else in this story. Not every man, discovering that he has been outmaneuvered by the precise trick he himself was attempting, responds with laughter. Some respond with violence, some with shame, some with a cold assessment of whether the other man needs to be neutralized before he becomes a problem. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews, two young men on a cold road to Chicago, looked at each other across whatever fire was burning between them, understood exactly what had just occurred, and found it genuinely funny. What does that tell us? It tells us that both men were, in that moment, still capable of something, still light enough, or perhaps still whole enough, to find their own failure amusing rather than threatening. Neither of them was so invested in the outcome of a single con that losing it threatened something essential. Both of them had enough interior space remaining to be delighted by an absurd situation. Hosea Matthews became, in the years that followed, the only person who could tell Dutch the truth and have it heard. Not always acted on, not always welcomed, but heard. For 2 decades, Hosea would function as Dutch's conscience, an imperfect and increasingly overruled conscience, but a present one, a consistent voice that said wait and slow down. And are we certain about this against a man who was progressively becoming incapable of waiting, slowing down, or entertaining uncertainty about anything? They decided, after the laughter, to work together. A practical decision as much as a personal one. Hosea brought a gift for the softer deceptions, the long con, the misdirection, the social performance. Dutch brought the ability to hold a room, to speak in a voice people wanted to believe, to project an absolute conviction that whatever he was currently saying was the only reasonable thing that could possibly be said. Together they were, by any honest accounting, formidable. Together they founded the van der Linde gang, though it was not called that yet, and it was not yet a gang in any serious sense. It was two men, a camp, and the beginning of an idea. The idea being this, that the America they had been given was not the only possible America, that there existed, further out from the cities and the courthouses and the Pinkerton offices, a version of this country where men like them could live by their own code, answer to no authority they had not chosen, and be free in the way the word was supposed to mean before governments and industrialists had quietly redefined it to mean something else entirely. Dutch van der Linde believed this with every part of himself. That is the third piece of evidence, and it cuts both ways, as all the most important evidence tends to do. They began to recruit, not aggressively at first, not with anything resembling a plan in the structured sense the word implies, more organically than that, the way that any genuine gravity gathers things to it, not by force, but by the simple fact of being more substantial than the surrounding emptiness. Arthur Morgan came first among the young ones. Dutch found him, or Dutch and Hosea found him, when Arthur was approximately 14 years of age, a young boy, alone, in circumstances that were going to kill him if something did not intervene. Dutch intervened. He taught Arthur to read. He taught him to shoot. He taught him to hunt and to think and to carry himself with the kind of self-possession that the world tends to withhold from boys who grow up the way Arthur Morgan had grown up, which is to say with nothing and no one to establish the basic premise that he was worth something. Dutch established that premise. Repeatedly, consistently, over years, he told Arthur Morgan that he was valuable, and he told him in the particular way that Dutch van der Linde told people things, which made the telling feel like revelation rather than reassurance. Arthur called Dutch his father, not always in those exact words, but in the way a person speaks about someone who shaped the fundamental architecture of who they became. Dutch was the father Arthur had not had, filling that specific and devastating vacancy with something that looked, from the outside, very much like the real thing. Then came John Marston, 1885, Illinois, a 12-year-old boy on the verge of being hanged by homesteaders for theft. Dutch arrived and stopped it. He took John in and gave him the same he had given Arthur: reading, shooting, hunting, self-worth, the van der Linde curriculum of distrust for government and love for the open country, and absolute loyalty to the people who had chosen you when the world had not. 2 boys, 2 orphans, 2 young men built from scratch by a man who had himself been built from scratch by absence. And in the late 1880s, the gang, now larger, now acquiring the structure that ambition eventually demands, carried out its first major bank robbery, $5,000. They stayed in town afterward. They went into the poorest quarters, the hovels, the orphanages, the shanties where the people lived that the town preferred not to look at directly, and they handed money to strangers. Dutch van der Linde stood in those streets and gave. The accounts of this are consistent enough across multiple sources that I believe it happened as described. And I believe, though I cannot prove it, and the honest witness admits what cannot be proven, that in those moments he was not performing. That the man who had grown up with nothing, who had watched the state take his father and the world take his mother, felt something real when he stood in those streets and put money into hands that had never expected anything from anyone. This is the 4th piece of evidence. It is the hardest one to account for. If you have already decided that Dutch van der Linde was always the monster, between 1877 and 1899, between the founding of the gang and the morning in Blackwater that changed everything, the van der Linde gang carried out roughly 36 to 37 bank robberies across the American frontier. 36 or 37. The exact count varies by account. What is not disputed is the scale. What is not disputed is that across those roughly 22 years, Dutch van der Linde built something that had never quite existed before in this particular form. Not a gang in the traditional criminal sense, not an enterprise organized around profit, though profit was necessary. Something stranger and more ambitious than either of those things. He built a family, not a perfect one, not a stable one, not one that would hold together when the pressure became sufficient, as we will see in the chapters ahead with increasing clarity, but a family, a collection of people the world had discarded, the orphaned boy, the starving exile, the drunk veteran, the young woman sleeping rough on the road, gathered around a man who told them that their discardment was the world's failure and not their own, that they were not lesser people who had fallen through the cracks of a functioning system. They were the proof that the system had never intended to function for people like them. He told them this for 2 decades. He believed it for most of that time. The question, the one we are carrying together through this long night, is when he stopped believing it. Whether there was a moment when the ideology became a costume rather than a conviction. Whether the man who handed money to strangers in the streets of an 1880s frontier town was the same man who pulled the trigger on a river dock in Blackwater 11 years later, or whether something happened in between, something that broke him, or revealed him, or simply finished a process that had been underway since a 15-year-old boy walked away from Philadelphia and kept walking long after there was anywhere specific left to walk toward. We will return to that. The night is still long, the evidence is still gathering, and the question remains exactly where we left it. Open, there is a book. It sits inside a canvas tent at a camp somewhere in the American wilderness. In the year 1899, the tent belongs to Dutch van der Linde. The book belongs to a man named Evelyn Miller, a philosopher, a former lecturer at Princeton University, a man who had looked at the America of his time with the particular disgust of someone who understood exactly what it was capable of being and found the gap between that potential and the reality intolerable. The book is called An American Eden. Its opening passage reads, in part, as follows. The real America, Miller argues, can only be found not in desires, but in the purity of its landscape. Dutch van der Linde kept this book in his tent, not on a shelf, not packed in a saddlebag for occasional reference, in his tent, where he slept, where he thought, where he sat alone in the hours before the camp woke and read by whatever light the morning offered. A man who carried a book the way other men carried weapons, not as an ornament, but as a tool, as a thing he actually needed and actually. I want you to hold that image for a moment before we move further into it. An outlaw in a tent in the wilderness, a wanted man with a price on his head, a gang leader responsible for the safety and direction of 23 people, all of them living outside the law, all of them depending on his judgment for their survival. And in the hours before the camp demanded anything of him, he read philosophy. This is not a small detail. It is not incidental color. It is, I would argue, one of the most important facts about Dutch van der Linde, and one of the most consistently misread ones. The easy reading is that the books were performance, props, the sophisticated outlaw cultivating the appearance of depth to impress the people around him and justify his own authority. The harder reading, and the one the evidence supports more consistently, is that the books were real, that Dutch van der Linde genuinely believed in what he read, that the philosophy was not decoration applied over a criminal enterprise, but the actual foundation on which the enterprise was built, and that this, paradoxically, makes everything that followed not simpler to understand, but more complex, more troubling, more genuinely worth examining in the dark, quietly, with the night long around us. Evelyn Miller was, within the world Dutch inhabited, something between a prophet and a mirror, a man who had stood inside the institutions, Princeton, the lecture hall, the academic world with its formal structures and its credentialed authority, and found them not merely inadequate but actively dishonest, who had retreated from those institutions into the countryside, into the landscape itself, and begun writing from that position of deliberate withdrawal. who argued in texts that found a readership well beyond the academic world, that had produced and then rejected him, that the authentic America was not the America of the cities and the courts and the expanding industrial machinery. It was the land, the unmediated land, the country that existed before men in offices decided what it was for. Henry David Thoreau had said something similar decades earlier on the shore of Walden Pond. Thoreau's Walden, his extended meditation on what happens when a man steps outside the machinery of civilized life and attempts to live with genuine simplicity, was the philosophical ancestor of everything Miller wrote. The same distrust of appetite, the same belief that the authentic life required a kind of deliberate poverty, a voluntary reduction of needs to what the land could honestly provide, the same conviction that civilization, as practiced, was not the elevation of humanity, but its corruption. Miller took these ideas and sharpened them, made them angrier, less pastoral, more political, less about the individual soul's quiet communion with nature, and more about the collective failure of a society that had chosen appetite over authenticity and was now reaping the consequence. Dutch van der Linde read Miller the way a man reads someone who has finally found the language for something he has been trying to say his entire life. And here is what I need you to understand about that. He was not wrong. I mean that precisely. The critique that Miller was making, and that Dutch absorbed and applied, and eventually weaponized into something it was never meant to be, was not an absurd or dishonest critique. The America of 1899 was exactly what Miller described, an America in which the gap between the freedom it promised and the freedom it delivered was vast and growing, in which industrial expansion was consuming the landscape and the people in it with equal indifference, in which the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private law enforcement company working not for the public good, but for whoever paid its retainer, pursued working men across state lines on behalf of railroad barons and oil tycoons, in which the frontier that had represented, however mythologically, a space outside the machinery, was being closed systematically by the very forces that had always benefited from the closure of every space outside their control. Dutch van der Linde was not imagining this. He was living in it, and his response to it, to gather the people the machinery had discarded, to build a community organized around different principles, to live outside the law, because the law had organized itself around the protection of power rather than the protection of people, was not, in its original form, simply criminal. It was, in its original form, a genuinely political act. This is the fifth piece of evidence. Hold it carefully. We are going to need it later when the counter-evidence arrives, and the counter-evidence is considerable, and some of it is very hard to look at directly. The gang at its height, and by height, I mean the period running from the late 1880s into the early 1890s, before the pressure from the law became sufficient to begin distorting everything inside it, was a community of genuine complexity. 23 members by the time the events of 1809 began, men and women, multiple races, multiple nationalities. Dutch van der Linde did not build a gang that looked like any single version of America's mythology of itself. He built one that looked, accidentally or deliberately, more like what America actually was: diverse, complicated, full of people who had arrived from different directions and wound up in the same place through different combinations of circumstance and choice and desperation. There was Javier Escuela, a young Mexican exile found in 1895 stealing chickens on a cold road, alone and starving. Dutch fed him, wrapped him in warm clothing, extended an invitation that Javier, by any honest accounting, had no reason to expect from anyone. Javier would become one of the gang's most loyal members. He idolized Dutch's philosophy with the particular intensity who had experienced, in their own body, exactly the kind of exclusion and disposability that the philosophy diagnosed. There was Tilly Jackson, found sleeping rough after leaving a gang that had treated her as less than a person. Dutch took her in and taught her to read. not because she was useful to him immediately. She was not yet. But because she was there, and she was in need. And the principle that Dutch claimed to operate from demanded that the response to someone in need was to extend a hand rather than to pass by. There was Lenny Summers, already literate, already sharp, already carrying in his young black body the particular weight that the America of 1899 placed on young black men, which was the weight of existing in a country that had recently fought a war over whether they were people and had arrived at a technical, while finding ways, in practice, to continue answering. Dutch welcomed him without the qualifications that the world around him would have imposed. There was Charles Smith, a man of black and Native American descent, accustomed to surviving alone, accustomed to being treated as an outsider in every context he entered. He was surprised by his own later account, by how fairly Dutch treated him, surprised enough by it that he decided to stay, having found, perhaps for the first time, a place he felt he belonged in. I want to be careful here. I am not arguing that Dutch van der Linde was a good man. I have not yet presented enough evidence to argue anything with confidence, and I am aware of what is still to come. What I am arguing, in this chapter, with this evidence, is that the man who built this community in these years was doing something real, something that cost him something that could not be reduced entirely to calculation. A man who rescues people for purely strategic reasons does not scold his enforcer for stealing from the poor, does not sit with two orphaned boys in the firelight reading from a philosopher who died before either of them was born, does not go into the hovels and orphanages of a frontier town and distribute money to strangers who will never be able to repay him and have no leverage over him. He did all of those things. The record is clear on all. The philosophy, as Dutch lived it in those years, had a specific and consistent shape. The world as it existed was organized around the interests of the powerful. The government existed to protect those interests and to suppress everything that threatened them. The law was not justice, it was enforcement. The Pinkerton Agency was not law enforcement in any meaningful sense. It was a private army deployed on behalf of men like Leviticus Cornwall, the oil baron, who would become one of the gang's central antagonists in the years ahead, a man modelled so precisely on the real Gilded Age industrialists who actually did use private armies to crush opposition that the fictional and the historical are nearly indistinguishable. Against this, against the government and its enforcers and the industrialists who owned them, Dutch proposed a counterworld, a savage utopia. Not a utopia in the soft sense of a perfect society with perfect people. He was too honest about human nature, or at least too honest about it in those years, to believe in perfection. Savage was the operative word. A world where men and women lived by the demands of genuine survival rather than the manufactured demands of a consumer civilization, where they answered to each other rather than to institutions, where the code was honest because it was their own code, built from their own experience, rather than inherited from people who had organized the code around the perpetuation of their own advantage. He called it freedom. And when he said the word, people believed him. This is the detail that matters most in understanding the phenomenon of Dutch van der Linde, separate from the question of whether he deserved to be believed. He was not a charismatic man in the simple sense that the word charisma sometimes implies. The easy confidence, the surface charm, the ability to make a room feel warmer by entering it. He was charismatic in the deeper and rarer sense, in the sense of a man whose conviction was so total that it created in the people around him the experience of certainty. When Dutch van der Linde told you that the life you were living was the right life, you felt it, not as a pleasant reassurance, not as flattery, but as something closer to recognition, as though he had identified something true about the world that you had always suspected but never had the language for, and was simply returning it to you in a form you could carry. Hosea Matthews, who knew Dutch better than anyone, who had been there from the beginning, who had spent 20 years watching him up close, was not a credulous man. Hosea was a con artist by training and by temperament. He had made a profession of reading people, of identifying the mechanisms of belief and trust, and using them with technical precision. He was not easy to fool, and he was not easy to move. He believed in Dutch. For a very long time, across very considerable evidence that belief was becoming unjustified, he continued to believe in some version of Dutch van der Linde, not blindly. Hosea's doubts were real and vocal and documented, but the doubts existed inside a larger framework of loyalty that was, at its core, the loyalty of a man who had watched Dutch do something real in those early years, and could not entirely abandon the memory of it, even as the present became increasingly difficult to defend. That is significant. That is not the testimony of a fool who was taken in by a convincing performance. There was a woman named Annabelle. The record on Annabelle is thinner than the record on almost anyone else in this story. And I want to acknowledge that plainly rather than paper over it with elaboration she has not earned. We do not know her background. We do not know how she and Dutch met. We do not know in any specific way what their life together looked like, whether it was complicated, whether it had the particular texture of a life lived in movement and danger and conditional safety. What we know is that Dutch loved her. The evidence for this is not in any tender account of their relationship. It is in what happened when she died. Colm O'Driscoll was, for a period before the events of the game, a figure Dutch maintained a working relationship, not a friendship. Dutch disliked how Colm treated his own men as disposable, disliked the mockery Colm made of Dutch's philosophy, saw in Colm's leadership the pure transactional violence that Dutch's entire worldview was organized against. But a relationship of mutual tolerance, grounded in the practical reality that two gangs operating in the same territory were better served by a truce than by a war. Dutch killed Colm's brother. The reasons are not recorded with any clarity. The exact circumstances, whether it was deliberate provocation, an act of passion, a calculated removal of a threat, are lost. What survived is only the fact of it and its consequence. Colm killed Annabelle, and Dutch van der Linde, who had built his entire philosophy on the premise that freedom meant living without the consuming passions of civilization, the appetites, the griefs, the attachments that made men controllable, was devastated, specifically, visibly, lastingly devastated. He did not recover from it cleanly. The blood feud that followed between the van der Linde gang and the O'Driscoll boys was not a strategic decision. It was grief. It was rage. It was the particular fury of a man who had told himself and everyone around him that he had elevated himself above the mechanisms of personal loss, and then discovered that he had not elevated himself at all. That Annabelle's death hurt exactly as much as the death of anyone loved by anyone who loved them, and that no philosophy could hold that hurt at a distance sufficient to make it manageable. This is the sixth piece of evidence, and I offer it in the spirit of the anonymous witness, who does not editorialize, but simply reports what he observed. I observed a man who loved a woman and lost her, and was never quite the same after. Whether that grief explains what came later, whether it was the first fracture in something that had been, until that moment, structurally sound, I cannot say with certainty. I only know that it happened, and that it mattered, and that Dutch van der Linde's relationship with loss after Annabelle was never the uncomplicated thing his philosophy had required it to be. Molly O'Shea arrived in Dutch's life sometime before 1899, a young Irish woman, described by those who knew her as someone who carried, beneath a surface composed of careful presentation, a very specific kind of longing, not for money, not for the outlaw life in its rougher dimensions, for Dutch, for the particular experience of being chosen by Dutch van der Linde, of being the person that the most compelling man in the room had decided to love. It is easy and reductive to describe Molly primarily through her infatuation. She was more than it, but it was real, and it was consequential, and it operated in the context of a man who, by 1899, had less to offer her than she believed she had found. Dutch's affection for Molly was genuine in its early form. It became over the course of the game's events, increasingly perfunctory, increasingly organized around the gang's needs rather than her own. She was loved in the way that the camp was fed, as a practical necessity, addressed when circumstances permitted, not as a person with her own interior life making its own demands. She broke under it. Quietly, over time, she broke. Not dramatically, not at first, but steadily, in the way that people break when they have organized their existence around a connection that is slowly withdrawing its warmth while maintaining its form. What happened to Molly O'Shea is one of the facts in this record that I find most difficult to report without editorializing, and so I will report it plainly and let you sit with it. Micah Bell accused her of informing to the Pinkertons. The evidence for this accusation was not conclusive. The accusation came from Micah Bell, a man we will examine at considerable length in the chapters ahead, a man whose relationship with truth was, to put it with restraint, flexible. Susan Grimshaw shot Molly before the accusation could be properly examined. Dutch said nothing, did not intervene, did not question the evidence, did not extend to the woman who had loved him for years the most basic protection of saying wait. She died with the accusation unresolved. The truth of whether she had informed or not died with her. Dutch van der Linde, who had built a community on the principle that loyalty was sacred and that the powerful had a duty to protect the vulnerable, watched it happen and kept his silence. We are not, in this chapter, supposed to be building the case against Dutch. That chapter is coming. But I would be dishonest if I pretended that this detail could wait, that it belongs only in the darker accounting of this man's record. It belongs here in the chapter about the saint, because the saint and the monster were always occupying the same body, always, at every point in this story, present simultaneously. Molly O'Shea is the evidence that even at his most idealistic, Dutch van der Linde contained within him something that could watch a woman he had loved be shot without uttering a word in her defense. This is the seventh piece of evidence, and it sits in direct, irresolvable tension with everything else in this chapter. By the mid-1890s, the Van der Linde gang was a genuine community, 23 members at its, a camp that moved but maintained, wherever it settled, a specific character, a kitchen, a medical area, a place for a social gathering space where the gang ate together and in the better evenings is existed in something that resembled, if you did not examine the surrounding circumstances too closely, a kind of domestic peace. Dutch read to the camp sometimes, not privately, not in his tent alone, but to whoever was gathered. The books he carried, Miller, and by some accounts Emerson, and whatever else he had managed to acquire from the towns they passed through, were not private property in the possessive sense. They were shared resources. The ideas in them were offered to anyone who wanted them, including people who had never been offered ideas before, in any formal sense. Arthur and John sat with those readings as young men. The concepts went over their heads, or over John's head at least. Arthur was, by all accounts, more intellectually receptive than he ever gave himself credit for. But they sat with the readings. The voice reading them mattered as much as the content. A man who cared enough to read to you was a man who believed you were worth reading to, who believed that the ideas in those books were not the private property of people with formal education, but belonged to anyone with the intelligence and the will to engage with them. Dutch van der Linde believed that. In those years, in those evenings by the fire, I believe he genuinely. The gang also operated, in those years, according to a code that Dutch enforced with real consistency. Do not steal from the poor. The memory of those 1887 streets, the hovels and orphanages, lived inside the code as a founding principle. Do not harm civilians unnecessarily. Do not abandon the people in this circle, because this circle is what we have instead of the world that abandoned us. He held to this code. Not perfectly. The record, even for the best years, contains exceptions and compromises, but consistently enough that the people around him believed the code was real, believed he would honor it, organized their own loyalty around that belief, and he taught. This is the detail about Dutch van der Linde that I find, of all the details in this record, the most quietly extraordinary. He taught, constantly, everything he knew. Reading, shooting, hunting, the philosophical framework he had built from 20 years of living outside the society that had produced him. He offered to the people around him as freely as he could offer it, not because teaching was used for him in any strategic sense, because he believed, and I am confident he believed it, in those years, without calculation, that the people around him deserved to know what he knew, deserved to have access to the tools that the world had made deliberately difficult for people like them to access. He taught Arthur Morgan to read. Think about what that means in 1878 in the American wilderness with a 14-year-old boy who had no reason to expect anything from anyone. He sat with him. He worked through the words. He went back when the boy struggled and went back again. He was patient with the failure in the way that only people who genuinely believe in the thing they are teaching can be patient, not tolerating failure but refusing to accept it as a verdict. Arthur Morgan learned to read from Dutch van der Linde. Arthur Morgan spent the last chapter of his life in a journal, writing in it, drawing in it, filling its pages with the interior life of a man who had arrived at the end of everything and was trying to make sense of it. The journal exists because Dutch taught him to write, the most intimate document in the entire story of the van der Linde gang. The record of Arthur Morgan's conscience, his grief, his final reckoning with who he was and who he had served, exists because Dutch van der Linde sat with a 14-year-old boy and refused to accept his illiteracy as inevitable. This is the 8th piece of evidence. It is among the most powerful in the case for Dutch van der Linde, and it does not cancel the counter-evidence. Nothing in this story cancels anything else. That is precisely the point. That is precisely what makes the question we are carrying so difficult to set down. In the years of the gang's idealistic, roughly 1887 through 1893, before the pressure began building toward the breaking point, Dutch van der Linde was living in the closest approximation of the life he had described in the wilderness, with a book and a theory, and a man who laughed at a campfire on the road to Chicago. He was not a good man in any simple accounting. The robberies were real. The violence was real. The Pinkerton attention that was slowly, steadily ratcheting toward the gang was real, and Dutch's responses to it were not always the responses of a man whose philosophy extended generously to the people he was robbing or the communities his actions destabilized. But he was something more complicated than a criminal, something that the simple language of criminality fails to adequately describe. A man who had taken the specific damage of his own history. The absent father consumed by the government, the dead mother learned about from a stranger, the 15 years on the road building a self from nothing, and had tried, with genuine effort and genuine intelligence, to make something out of it, something that other people could live in, something that meant more than the accumulation of money and the avoidance of prison. He was a man with a theory, a man who read, a man who taught, a man who stood in the streets of a frontier town in 1887 and put money into the hands of strangers for no reason except that his own theory of justice demanded it. That man existed. He was real. And what happened to him, whether something in the world destroyed him, or whether he destroyed himself, or whether the man who stood in those streets was always underneath the theory and the reading and the firelight philosophy, the same man who would eventually pull a trigger on a river dock, is the question we are going to spend the rest of this long night trying to understand. We are not there yet, but we are getting closer. There is a horse. His name is the Count. He is, by every account that survives, an exceptional animal. Not exceptional in the way that working horses are exceptional. Reliable, strong, suited to the demands placed on them. Exceptional in the way that certain rare animals are exceptional, which is to say that he appears to have formed, with the specific human being he belonged to, a bond that operated outside the normal transactional logic of a man and his mount. The Count would not be ridden by anyone else. This is Arthur Morgan attempted it once. He was thrown, he said, faster than a bull. The Count did not merely resist, he rejected. He had organized his loyalty around a single person with a totality that made any other claimant not merely unsuccessful, but immediately and emphatically unwelcome. I begin this chapter with the Count because the horse tells us something about Dutch van der Linde that the philosophy does not. The philosophy was public. It was performed, in the best sense of that word, enacted for an audience, refined through telling, shaped by the responses it generated in the people who heard it. The Count was not public. The Count was private in the way that only a relationship between a man and an animal can be truly private, unmediated by language, unfiltered by the considerations of image or authority, or the constant performance of self that leadership demands. The Count chose Dutch, not from training, not from conditioning in the usual sense. Animals that bond this completely with a single person are not conditioned into it. They arrive at it. They make, in whatever way animals make decisions, a determination about a specific human being that is not transferable to any other. Dutch van der Linde was the kind of man that a horse made that determination about. What does that tell us? I am not certain I can say exactly, but I believe it tells us something real about the interior of the man, something that existed beneath the philosophy and the speeches and the increasingly elaborate justifications of increasingly difficult decisions, something that a horse could perceive and respond to, and that a horse has no reason to perform for, and no capacity to be deceived by. Whatever that something was, whatever it is that makes an exceptional animal choose a specific human being with a totality that excludes everyone else. Dutch van der Linde had it. He had it in the years of the gang's idealistic peak. He appears, by the evidence, to have had it still in the final years, when almost everything else had gone. The Count is one of the few constants in a story full of things that change past recognition. I find that worth sitting with. I am not sure what to do with it as evidence, but I find it worth sitting with. Hosea Matthews. If Dutch van der Linde was the gravity at the center of the van der Linde gang, the force that everything else organized itself around, then Hosea Matthews was the only other body in that system, with sufficient mass to exert a genuine counterpull, not equal, not strong enough in the end to prevent the trajectory that would eventually carry Dutch past the point of any orbit at all, but real, consistent, present across the entire arc of the story in a way that no other relationship was. They had been together since the beginning, since the road to Chicago and the mutual attempted robbery and the laughter that followed it, since before there was a gang, before there was a philosophy, Chu articulated in borrowed language from a Princeton lecturer, before there were 23 people whose survival depended on Dutch van der Linde's judgment. Hosea had watched Dutch build all of it from the first stone. He had also watched, with increasing clarity and increasing sorrow, what the building of it was doing to the builder. The dynamic between them, in the years running up to 1899, was not simple loyalty versus simple doubt. It was more layered than that, and more painful. Hosea believed in what the gang had been in its best years. He had been there for those years. He knew, from direct experience rather than from Dutch's increasingly retrospective descriptions of them, that the community they had built had been real, had offered real shelter to real people who had needed it, had operated, for a period, according to genuine principles rather than principles invoked to justify decisions already made on other grounds. Hosea wanted to protect that memory, wanted to protect Dutch's connection to it, wanted, in the increasingly difficult years of 1899, to be the voice that said wait and slow down. And are we certain about this? Not as opposition, not as a challenge to Dutch's authority, but as the specific function he had always served, the conscience that lived inside the operation rather than outside it, speaking from a position of genuine loyalty rather than from the comfortable distance of moral judgment. Dutch could not hear it anymore. This is not a simple thing to say, and I want to be precise about it. It was not that Dutch stopped loving Hosea. The evidence does not support that. What the evidence supports is something more specific and perhaps more tragic. That Dutch's need to be right had by 1899 grown larger than his capacity to be challenged. That the years of pressure, of law enforcement tightening its net, of plans that did not work and opportunities that did not materialize, and the Tahiti dream receding further into the distance each passing season. Those years had done something to Dutch van der Linde's relationship with dissent, a man who begins by genuinely believing that he has found a better way of living, and who spends 2 decades watching that belief tested by the world, arrives eventually at a crossroad. Either the belief adapts, incorporates the complications, admits the failures, becomes more honest if less grand, or it calcifies. It becomes defended rather than examined. It becomes the thing that must be protected at any cost, because the cost of admitting its inadequacy is too large to contemplate. Something calcified in Dutch van der Linde. The exact moment is impossible to identify. It was not a single event. It was a process, slow, probably invisible from the inside, visible in retrospect from almost every angle. Hosea saw it happening, articulated it in whatever conversations the record has preserved fragments of, could not stop it. Because Hosea Matthews, for all his intelligence and his decades of proximity to the truth of Dutch van der Linde, had one limitation that would ultimately cost him everything. He loved Dutch, not in a way he could set aside when it became inconvenient, not in a way that could be rationally overridden by the accumulating evidence that something was going seriously wrong. He loved him, and the specific gravity of that love, 20 years of it, built from the campfire on the road to Chicago, through every robbery, and every winter camp, and every morning, when the dream seemed still possible, kept Hosea in the orbit of a man he was increasingly unable to trust, long past the point at which leaving might have saved his life. This is the 9th piece of evidence. A man who inspired that quality of loyalty across that length of time, in a man as perceptive as Hosea Matthews, was not nothing, was not simply performing the role of someone worth believing in. He was worth believing in. For a very long time, across very considerable evidence, he was worth believing in. And then Hosea was shot dead in Saint Denis by a Pinkerton agent, while Dutch watched from a rooftop, and the last internal constraint on Dutch van der Linde died with him on a crowded street in the city Dutch despised most, Arthur Morgan. The relationship between Dutch van der Linde and Arthur Morgan is, of all the relationships in this record, the one I return to most often when the question we are carrying begins to feel too heavy to hold, because it is the relationship that contains within its arc the entire argument. The case for Dutch and the case against him are both made most powerfully through what he was to Arthur, and what he eventually did to Arthur. Arthur came to Dutch as a child, 14 years old, in circumstances that were going to kill him if someone did not intervene. Dutch intervened, and what Dutch built in Arthur over the following years, the reading, the shooting, the self-possession, the fundamental premise that Arthur Morgan was a person of value rather than a problem to be solved or a body to be used, was real, was the most important thing that had ever been done for Arthur Morgan, was, in Arthur's own interior reckoning, the foundation of everything he was capable of. Dutch called Arthur his enforcer by 1899. The word carries, in its context, 2 meanings simultaneously. Arthur was Dutch's most capable operative, the person he trusted with the most dangerous assignments, the person he sent when something needed to be done and done correctly. In that sense, enforcer is a job title, a functional description of a role inside an organization. But Dutch also meant it as something more than that, as a statement about who Arthur was, not just to the gang but to Dutch personally, as the son he had never had in the biological sense, the boy he had raised from the most damaged raw material the road had offered him, and turned into the most capable man in the... Arthur knew this. He carried it. He carried it with the particular weight of a person who owes the most fundamental debt, the debt of being made into a person at all, to a man he is increasingly unable to trust, because Arthur saw the change in Dutch before almost anyone else did, or felt it, at least. Arthur Morgan was not a man of elaborate philosophical vocabulary, but he was a man of precise instinct, and his instinct told him, with increasing urgency across the events of 1899, that something in Dutch was no longer the thing that had built him. He raised it, carefully, in the way that you raised doubts with, who made you, who gave you everything you have in terms of self and capability and place in the world, not with the directness of an equal, with the tentativeness of a son who suspects his father of something and cannot bring himself to name it clearly, because naming it clearly would require him to also acknowledge what it means for the debt he cannot repay. Dutch could not hear it from Arthur either. The pattern that had emerged with Hosea, the inability to absorb dissent from the people who loved him most, repeated itself with Arthur, and in Arthur's case, the stakes were higher, because Arthur was not only Dutch's conscience, he was Dutch's enforcer. He was the mechanism through which Dutch's plans were carried out. When Dutch's plans became something that Arthur could no longer enforce with clear conviction, when the doubt in Arthur began translating into hesitation, into questions, into the beginnings of a visible distance between what Arthur was doing and what Arthur believed was right, Dutch experienced it not as the testimony of someone who loved him, raising a genuine concern. He experienced it as disloyalty. This misreading, this translation of concern into betrayal, is among the most revealing things in the entire record of Dutch van der Linde, because the misreading was not accidental. It was structural. It was the inevitable consequence of a man who had organized his entire sense of self around the correctness of his own vision. Encountering the experience of someone inside that vision beginning to doubt it, doubt from outside was manageable. Edgar Ross and the Bureau of Investigation, Leviticus Cornwall and the Pinkertons, their opposition confirmed the vision. The powerful always opposed the truthful. Their opposition was expected, was incorporated into the worldview as evidence that the worldview was right. Doubt from inside was something else entirely. Doubt from inside meant that the vision might be wrong, and if the vision was wrong, then the 23 people organized around it had been given something false. The orphans he had gathered and educated and shaped into something from nothing. If the vision was wrong, what had he actually given them? Dutch could not go there. The armor that protected him from going there was the conviction that the doubters were mistaken, were failing him, were, in the final stages, actively betraying him. Arthur's growing doubt was reframed inside Dutch's increasingly rigid interior world as Arthur's failure to hold to what was right. The man who had taught Arthur Morgan to read, who had sat with him and worked through the words and refused to accept his failure as inevitable, came to experience the mature Arthur Morgan's moral hesitation as a form of personal attack. That distance between the man who built Arthur and the man who eventually walked away from him is one of the largest distances in this record, and it is a distance that Dutch van der Linde created, step by step, choice by choice, reframing by reframing. This is the 10th piece of evidence. It is the heaviest one so far. John Marston. John is a different kind of evidence than Arthur. Arthur was Dutch's first son, in all but the legal sense, the boy Dutch made from the ground up, whose fundamental character bears Dutch's influence at every level. John was the second, found later, shaped similarly, but carrying from the beginning a slightly different quality of independence, a stubbornness that expressed itself not as Arthur's moral precision, but as John's practical insistence on the life rather than the life the gang required. John left the gang in 1896. This fact, that John Marston, at some point before the events of the game, gathered Abigail and young Jack and walked out of the van der Linde camp, is one of the most clarifying moments in Dutch's story, and it happened before the story we are most familiar with had properly begun. Dutch experienced John's departure as betrayal, not as a man choosing a different life, not as the entirely reasonable decision of a person who had built a family of his own, and wanted to give that family something other than the permanent uncertainty of the outlaw camp as betrayal, a violation of the loyalty that Dutch's world organized itself around, the specific and unforgivable act of choosing someone over Dutch's vision. John came back in 1897. The reasons are not fully detailed in the record. He came back and he brought the baby, and he accepted his share of responsibility for Jack. Arthur never fully forgave him for the leaving. The gang never fully forgave him. Dutch's forgiveness was public and performed, and the evidence suggests not entirely genuine, because something shifted in Dutch's relationship with John Marston. After the departure and return, the affection remained. The habit of fatherhood remained, but the absolute trust, the trust that Dutch had extended to Arthur across Arthur's entire visible lifetime, never quite reconstituted itself around John. John had demonstrated, by leaving, that he was capable of choosing something other than Dutch. That awareness lived inside Dutch's relationship with John from 1897 onward, coloring every interaction, shaping every judgment. John was the son who had proved he could leave. That knowledge, in a man increasingly organized around the fear of abandonment, was not a small thing. Micah Bell arrived in the story approximately 5 months before the events of 1899 began. At a place called Crenshaw Hill, Dutch had arranged to sell stolen gold to local contacts. The deal went wrong. The way deals went wrong in that life, suddenly and with violence. A newcomer named Micah Bell intervened. He fought alongside Dutch when fighting was required, handled himself with the competence of a man who had been in this specific kind of situation many times before, and Dutch emerged from the altercation alive. He invited Micah into the gang as a gesture of gratitude. It was the most consequential invitation Dutch van der Linde ever extended, and it differed from every previous invitation in one fundamental way. Every person Dutch had recruited before Micah, Hosea, Arthur, John, Javier, Tilly, Bill, Lenny, Charles, had been recruited because Dutch saw in them something that needed protection, something damaged or vulnerable or excluded that his particular community could shelter. He built the gang from the discarded. He built it from the people the world had decided were not worth keeping. That was the founding principle. That was what gave the whole enterprise its moral shape. However compromised that shape became over time, Micah Bell was not discarded. Micah Bell was expelled. There is a difference between being discarded by a world that never properly valued you and being rejected by every community you have ever touched because of something in your character that makes sustained human connection impossible. Micah had been in the gang for only months before Arthur and Hosea could see clearly what he was, before the older members of the community could identify in the specific quality of Micah's presence. The difference between a man who had arrived in hard circumstances and a man who produced hard circumstances wherever he went. Dutch could not see it, or would not. This is perhaps the most important distinction in the entire record. Was Dutch's blindness to Micah a genuine failure of perception, the consequence of gratitude, the specific loyalty of a man who had been saved by someone and could not afterwards see them clear? Or was it something more deliberate? Did Dutch, on some level that he never articulated and perhaps never fully acknowledged, recognize in Micah Bell something useful? A man who would not question him, who would flatter his decisions rather than challenge them, who would provide in the increasingly difficult landscape of 1899 the unconditional agreement that Hosea and Arthur were no longer capable of offering. The record cannot answer this with certainty. What the record can say is that Micah Bell arrived in the gang 5 months before Blackwater and became, in that time, Dutch's most trusted consultant, not through demonstrated wisdom, not through the long record of loyalty and capability that Arthur and Hosea had built over decades, through the simpler mechanism of never saying no, of always saying yes, of finding in every plan Dutch proposed, however reckless, however obviously driven by desperation rather than calculation, the confirmation that Dutch needed to protect. There is a name for the person who only ever tells a powerful man what he wants to hear. The name is not friend, but Dutch van der Linde, by the spring of 1899, had arrived at a place where the distinction between the two had become, for him, functionally invisible. This is the 11th piece of evidence, and it is the evidence that, more than any other single fact in this record, suggests that whatever was going to happen in Blackwater was not an accident, was not bad luck or poor timing, or the inevitable consequence of living outside the law in a country that was closing its frontier, was the result of a man whose capacity for genuine self-examination had been by that point sufficiently compromised that he could not identify his own worst impulse even when it was standing next to him, telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. I want to return briefly to the Count, because there is something in the horse that I did not finish with at the beginning of this chapter, and that I think matters more now than it did when we started. The Count chose Dutch, made, in whatever way horses make these decisions, a total and exclusive commitment to a single human being, did not extend that commitment to anyone else, did not perform it differently depending on the audience, did not calibrate it based on how Dutch was doing, or what Dutch had most recently done, or whether the decisions Dutch was making were the decisions of the man the Count had originally committed to. The Count simply continued. Across the Blackwater massacre and its consequences, across the events of 1899 in all their escalating difficulty, across the decisions that drove Hosea away from full trust and drove Arthur toward the exit, and drove John back toward the family he had tried to choose. Through all of it, the Count continued. The same commitment, the same exclusion of all other riders, the same absolute loyalty to a specific person whose claim on that loyalty was, from the outside, increasingly difficult to justify. I am not arguing that the Count's loyalty was evidence that Dutch deserved it. I am observing that the capacity Dutch had to inspire that quality of loyalty in a horse who cannot be reasoned with or charmed or philosophized into position tells us something about what was genuinely present in the man, even as the man was becoming someone that the people who loved him most were losing their ability to follow. He was still, at his core, something real enough that a horse with no stake in the performance and no capacity for self-deception organized itself around it with a totality that excluded everyone else. Whatever that something was, whatever its name, it did not disappear when Dutch van der Linde began making decisions that would eventually destroy the community he had built from nothing. It was still there, alongside everything else, alongside all the evidence that is still to come. And some of it is very hard to hold. End of chapter 3. The Count won't continue, boss. Chapter 4, Hoga. Blackwater. Ye were chapter high. Jahan. The long question and shift hotter high, the ferry. Heidi McCourt. There were $150,000 hidden in the dark. Warad jabgang ne mountains min bang na shuru kia or Dutchka. Plan ek mantra. Bangaya jo kisi ko yakin nahi tha. Yahan hum. Pehli bar seriously pucheng kya ye cheese intentional fee. There is a ferry. It sits on the water near the town of Blackwater, in the state of West Elizabeth in the spring of 1899. It is carrying $150,000 in bank money. It is, by any reasonable calculation, the largest single score the van der Linde gang has ever been in a position to attempt. Dutch van der Linde looked at it and said yes. 2 people said no. Hosea Matthews said no. Arthur Morgan said no. The 2 people in the gang with the longest history, the deepest investment, the most accumulated experience of what Dutch's plans looked like when they worked and what they looked like when they did not. Both of them looked at the ferry and said, this is too much, too exposed, too populated, too close to a town that is too modern and too connected to the law enforcement infrastructure that is already too interested in us. Dutch looked at the ferry and said yes anyway. He had a plan. I want to be precise about the sequence of events that led to Blackwater, because the sequence matters. It is not simply the story of a bad decision made in the heat of a moment. It is the story of a bad decision made over the explicit objections of the people best positioned to identify its badness. At the urging of a man who had been in the gang for approximately 5 months, and who had demonstrated in those 5 months a consistent pattern of encouraging escalation over caution, Micah Bell brought the ferry to Dutch's attention. That fact alone, that the plan originated with Micah, rather than with Dutch's own strategic thinking, rather than with the careful that Hosea and Arthur had accumulated across 2 decades of operations, should have registered as significant. Dutch had built the gang on his own judgment, his own reading of situations, his own instinct for what was possible and what was catastrophic. The plans that had worked across 36 or 37 bank robberies had worked because Dutch trusted his own perception more than he trusted the perception of people who had not been doing this as long or as well. Now he was trusting Micah Bell, a man who had been present for 5 months, a man whose primary qualification was that he had saved Dutch's life in a fight at Crenshaw Hill, a man who had never demonstrated, in any observed interaction with the rest of the gang, anything resembling the judgment that 2 decades of operations required. The ferry plan was Micah's idea, and Dutch adopted it as his own. And when Hosea and Arthur raised their objections, Dutch overruled them with the phrase that had been becoming, across the months of 1899, increasingly automatic and decreasingly connected to any actual plan that could be described in detail. He had a plan. Hosea Matthews and Arthur Morgan were not present on the ferry when the robbery began. This detail is confirmed across multiple accounts, and it is, when you sit with it properly, one of the most clarifying facts in the entire record. Dutch's 2 most senior and most experienced people, the co-founder of the gang and the man Dutch called his enforcer, were not there. They had their own lead, a separate job. Whether Dutch arranged it this way deliberately, whether he understood on some level that Hosea and Arth's presence on the ferry would function as a continued argument against doing it at all, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the 2 people most likely to intervene, to slow the plan down, to force Dutch to examine it more carefully, were somewhere else. Micah Bell was there. Javier Escuela was there. John Marston was there. Davy Callender and Matt Callender were there. Jenny Kirk was there. Sean McGuire was there. 7 members of the gang. In April of 1899, on a ferry carrying $150,000 in bank money, with Dutch van der Linde and Micah Bell at the center of the operation. Javier Escuela would later describe what happened when the Pinkerton agents arrived. He used the phrase raining bullets, not a metaphor deployed for dramatic effect, a straight-faced description of a tactical situation that had become, very quickly, completely unwinnable. The Pinkerton agents had arrived in numbers, and from positions that suggested they had known, had been told, had come prepared for exactly what they found. The gang was not robbing an undefended ferry. They were walking into a prepared position. During the chaos, during the raining bullets and the screaming and the impossible arithmetic of too many armed men in too small a space, Dutch van der Linde shot a young woman in the head. Her name was Heidi McCourt. She was not a Pinkerton agent. She was not a law enforcement officer of any kind. She was a civilian, a young woman who was, by the accounts of the people who witnessed it, defenseless at the moment Dutch van der Linde raised his weapon and fired. John Marston witnessed it. Javier Escuela witnessed it. John would later say that Micah encouraged it. That Micah, in the chaos of the unwinnable situation, provided whatever verbal pressure or physical positioning or simple suggestion pushed Dutch's hand toward a trigger he might otherwise have left unpulled. Dutch justified it afterward as necessary. A survival decision in a moment where survival was genuinely in question and the calculations of ordinary morality could not apply. I am going to stay with this for a moment, because specific moment. Heidi McCourt, April 1899, a river dock in Blackwater, that the long question we have been carrying changes its character. Everything before this moment was evidence in a genuine argument. The orphans gathered and educated. and money distributed in the streets. The philosophy built from real reading of real thinkers who were asking real questions about a real injustice. The relationships, Hosea, Arthur, John, Javier, each one representing a genuine extension of something toward people the world had excluded. All of that evidence remained real, remained part of the record. Nothing that happened on the river dock in Blackwater erased any of it. But Heidi McCourt placed a weight on the other side of the scale that had not been there before. Not because it was the first violence. The robberies were violent. People had been hurt in those 36 or 37 operations across 22 years. Dutch van der Linde, been a pacifist, had never claimed to be, had built his gang in full acknowledgement that living outside the law in the late 19th century required a capacity for violence. What made Heidi McCourt different was the specific combination of three facts. The first fact, she was defenseless. The second fact, Micah encouraged it. The third fact, Dutch did it. A man who had built his entire moral framework on the principle that the powerful had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable, who had scolded his own enforcer for stealing from the poor, who had gone into the hovels, orphanages of an 1887 frontier town to give rather than take. That man raised a weapon at a defenseless young woman on the urging of the most morally compromised person in his camp and fired. Whether the monster was always there, waiting for the right pressure and the right voice to release it, or whether something in the preceding years had broken something in Dutch that made him capable of an act he would not have committed at an earlier version of himself, is precisely the question. And Heidi McCourt is the moment the question becomes impossible to set down. The gang fled north into the mountains of Ambarino, into a blizzard that was, in its brutal indifference to their situation, almost merciful. The same weather that made their flight miserable also made their pursuit difficult, and the Pinkertons could not follow them into conditions that the gang, by virtue of desperation rather than preparation, somehow managed to survive. They settled in an abandoned mining camp called Coulter. Davy Callender was dying. He had taken a gunshot wound during the ferry disaster that was not survivable in any camp, in any weather, with any medicine available to them. He died at Coulter and was buried in the frozen ground north of the settlement. Jenny Kirk died, her wounds sustained during the escape. Her burial north of Coulter alongside Davy, two people who had been alive before the ferry and were not alive after. Matt Callender had not made it out of Blackwater at all. He was captured by Agent Andrew Milton, the Pinkerton who would become the gang's primary pursuer through the events of 1899. Mac refused to give up the gang's location. He refused to say anything that would help the Pinkertons find the people he had ridden with. Milton killed him anyway, called it a mercy killing, with the specific contempt that certain kinds of authority figures deploy toward the deaths they cause to make the deaths feel like kindness. 3 people dead before the story we know has properly begun. Sean McGuire was captured, taken by bounty hunters, alive, held for later. John Marston had been shot, his wounds survivable but significant. The gang that gathered at Coulter was a gang that had been broken before the game opened, sitting in a blizzard in the mountains, with the Pinkertons tightening the distance behind them and the leader standing in front of them, asking for their faith. Dutch van der Linde stood before the remnants of his gang at Coulter and spoke. He asked them to trust him. He said they would survive. He said the storm would pass, the heat from the law would ease. They would find their way back to the plan, always back to the plan. And everything they had built and believed in and organized their lives around was still possible if they held together. Some of them believed him. This is perhaps the most extraordinary fact of the entire Blackwater sequence, that a man who had just led 7 members of his gang into an ambush, who had watched 3 of them die in the immediate aftermath, who had shot a defenseless civilian, on the urging of a man who had been in the camp for 5 months, stood in a blizzard and asked for faith, and received it. Not from everyone. The record is clear that Arthur and Hosea, in particular, blamed Micah for the Blackwater disaster. with a specificity and a fury that they did not turn with equal force on Dutch, whether that was protective loyalty, whether it was a necessary fiction that allowed them to continue functioning inside the gang, whether they were not yet willing to name what the evidence around them was suggesting about the man they had built their lives around, I cannot say. Probably some combination of all three. But they stayed. They stayed in the blizzard, in the ruined camp, with the dead not yet cold in the ground. They stayed. The $150,000 was not with them. Dutch had hidden it before the gang fled Blackwater, before the blizzard and Coulter and the frozen burials. Dutch and Hosea had taken the money from the ferry and hidden it somewhere near Blackwater, in the chaos of the aftermath, with Pinkertons closing in from every direction. They had found a location and concealed the money and left it there. Only Dutch and Hosea knew where it was. This detail, seemingly practical, seemingly the obvious precaution of two experienced outlaws securing their largest ever score against the possibility that the flight north would require them to travel. Light carries a weight that only becomes visible in retrospect. The money stayed hidden near Blackwater from April of 1899 through 1899's end, through the entire sequence of events that followed. The operations in the Heartlands, the intrigues in Lemoyne, the Saint-Denis bank robbery, the disaster that followed it, the time in Guarma, the return, the final collapse at Beaver Hollow. Through all of it, $150,000 sat hidden near a town the gang could not safely approach, known only to two people, one of whom was dead by the time the story reached its end. Dutch kept it there. Through every plan that required money they did not have, through every scheme that promised the gang's salvation, through the Tahiti dream and its endless iterations, through every moment when the money hidden near Blackwater could have been retrieved, distributed, used to give the people who had trusted him something tangible in exchange for everything they had risked and lost. He kept it there. And then, in the epilogue, in 1897, 8 years after Blackwater, he was found at Micah Bell's hideout with the money, having retrieved it at some point in the intervening years, having kept it after the gang was gone, with the one person he had chosen over all of them. The anonymous witness reports this without commentary. The listener will draw their own conclusions about what it means. The events that followed Blackwater, the full arc of 1899, the movement east, the operations that Dutch framed as stepping stones toward eventual escape, had a quality that I want to describe carefully, because it is easy to mischaracterize, and the mischaracterization matters. Dutch was not, in the months after Blackwater, simply falling apart. He was not visibly broken. He was not, to most of the people around him, obviously lost. He was still Dutch van der Linde, still the voice that could hold a room, still the man who could frame any situation, however desperate, in language that made continued effort feel like a choice rather than a compulsion. He orchestrated the robbery of Leviticus Cornwall's train. He managed the extraordinarily complex double game of setting the Grey family and the Braithwaite family against each other in Lemoyne, playing two powerful, paranoid, mutually hostile dynasties simultaneously, extracting resources from both before the inevitable discovery that he had been playing them both. These were not the actions of a man who had lost his capability. They required exactly the intelligence and the reading of rooms that Dutch had been building and refining since he was 15 years old on the road outside Philadelphia. But something had changed in the architecture of how he used that. Before Blackwater, Dutch's plans had been organized, at least in principle, around an outcome for the people in his care. The score was the means, the camp, the community, the people was the end. The money was for them. The operations were for them. The risk was justified by what it was building toward. After Blackwater, the relationship between means and ends began, slowly but observably, to invert. The plans became the point, the doing of the thing, the demonstration that Dutch van der Linde still had a plan, still had the capability, still had the authority to direct 23 people's lives toward an outcome he had identified, became more important than the outcome itself. Hosea saw it, articulated it, in the particular way that Hosea articulated things, not as accusation, not as confrontation, but as the careful concern of a man who had been watching the person he loved most in the world for 20 years and could see, in the specific quality of something recently changed, the shape of a danger that was not yet visible to everyone else. Dutch could not hear it. The armor had thickened, and Micah Bell was always there, standing next to the armor, telling Dutch it looked fine. There is a specific moment I want to place carefully before we leave the chapter of Blackwater and move into the longer deterioration that followed it. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not involve gunfire or confrontation or any of the more obviously significant events in the record. It is a small moment, quiet, verifiable, and I believe it is one of the most important in the entire story. At some point in the early period after Blackwater, in the mountains, in the cold, in the aftermath of Davy and Jenny dying, and Mac being killed, and the gang shivering in an abandoned mining camp in a blizzard, Dutch van der Linde stood before the people who remained and asked for their faith. And then he gave a speech, not the last speech he would give, not the last time he would stand before the people who depended on him and deploy his extraordinary ability to make the worst situation sound like a temporary setback on the road to something better. He would give versions of this speech many more times across the events of 1899. But this one, the Coulter speech in the blizzard with the dead barely buried, was the one where something shifted. Not in Dutch, necessarily. Something shifted. Arthur Morgan listened to the Coulter speech, heard the familiar cadences, the philosophy invoked as reassurance, the plan referenced without its details, the faith asked for without the accounting that faith is owed, and felt in the listening something he had not felt before in 20 years of listening to Dutch van der Linde speak. Distance, not disbelief, not yet, not the clean break that would come later, but a specific quality of distance, the sensation of hearing a voice you know intimately and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the mechanism of it, the way the words are assembled, the particular sequence of acknowledgement of difficulty, followed by reassurance of ability, followed by invocation of shared purpose, followed by the request that everyone simply hold on a little longer. Arthur had heard this sequence hundreds of times, had been moved by it hundreds of times, had organized his own behavior around it, the enforcing, the riding out, the doing of whatever Dutch's plan required, because the sequence had always before felt connected to something real, to a Dutch who genuinely believed what he was saying, to a plan that, however improvised, was genuinely oriented toward the welfare of the people depending on it. At Coulter, in the blizzard, Arthur Morgan heard the sequence and felt the distance. He did not leave. He would not leave for a very long time, and his reasons for staying would become one of the most complex moral tangles in the entire record. But he heard it differently, and the hearing of it differently was the beginning of the end of something that had lasted 20 years and had been, whatever its complications, whatever its compromises, something real. This is the 12th piece of evidence, and it carries a particular weight that I want to name carefully, because Arthur Morgan's ear was not an ordinary ear. It was the ear of a man who had been built by Dutch van der Linde from the ground up, who had learned to think and read and speak in large part through 20 years of proximity to Dutch's particular way of being in the world. If anyone could hear the difference between Dutch performing the speech and Dutch meaning it, it was Arthur Morgan. At Coulter, Arthur Morgan heard the difference and kept it to himself, in the particular silence of a son who has perceived something about his father that he is not yet ready to say aloud, because saying it aloud would make it real, and making it real would require him to decide what to do about it, and deciding what to do about it would mean deciding who he was, if he was not the man Dutch van der Linde had made him. He was not ready to decide that yet. The question we have been carrying, was Dutch van der Linde always the monster, or did something in this world break him along the way, has arrived by the end of this chapter at a point where it needs to be restated slightly, not abandoned, not replaced with a different question. Restated, because Blackwater does not answer it. What Blackwater does is complicate it in ways that the earlier evidence had not. Before Blackwater, the question was genuinely bilateral. There was real evidence on both sides. The saint and the monster were both present in the record, and their relative weight could be argued in either direction without obvious dishonesty. After Blackwater, the weight begins to shift, not because the evidence for the saint disappears. It does not. Arthur's journal still exists because Dutch taught him to write. Javier Escuela's loyalty still exists because Dutch fed a starving young man on a cold road and asked nothing immediately in return. The reading circles and the code and the orphans gathered from roadsides, none of it becomes retroactively false because of what happened on the ferry. But Heidi McCourt is in the record now. 3 dead gang members are in the record now. A hidden $150,000, known only to Dutch, is in the record now. And the first audible crack in Arthur Morgan's 20-year faith is in the record now. The question shifts from, was he always the monster, to, at what point did the monster become the primary occupant? And the honest answer, the one the anonymous witness offers, having stood at the edge of Coulter in the blizzard and watched a man ask for faith he had not fully earned, is that the monster did not arrive at Blackwater fully formed. It was already in residence. It had been gathering mass for years, fed by the pressure and the paranoia and the calcifying certainty and the 5 months of Micah Bell telling Dutch everything he wanted to. Blackwater did not create the monster. Blackwater gave it its first clear action in the record, and everything that follows, Saint-Denis, Guarma, Beaver Hollow, Cochine, is the story of that monster expanding to fill the space that Dutch van der Linde's original self was progressively vacating. The question is still open, but it is heavier now than it was, and the night is still long. There is a street in Saint-Denis, wide, crowded, lit in the particular way that the most modern city in the region was lit in 1899. Gas lamps and commerce, and the specific noise of a place that has decided is the future, and is moving toward that future with an energy that does not pause to consider what it is leaving behind. Saint-Denis was everything Dutch van der Linde despised made architectural. The government and the money and the social performance of civilization given permanent form in stone and iron and gaslight. He hated it genuinely. That hatred was real. Whatever else had become complicated or compromised or distorted by 1899, his contempt for what Saint-Denis represented, the industrial machine, the government apparatus that served it, the erasure of everything the frontier had meant, was not performed. It was in his body when he walked those streets, in the specific tension of a man moving through a landscape that offends every instinct he has developed across a lifetime of deliberate opposition. And yet he kept returning to it, because Saint-Denis had something Dutch needed, which was money, the kind of money that the Tahiti plan still referenced, still invoked, still the destination on the map that justified every decision made on the road toward it, required the kind of money that the Blackwater score, hidden and inaccessible, was supposed to have provided and had not. The Saint-Denis bank robbery was Dutch's plan, his reading of the city, his assessment of the vault, his judgment about the timing and the personnel and the acceptable level of risk. He brought the gang into the city he despised, pointed them at the thing he needed, and asked them to trust him. He had a plan. Hosea Matthews died on a street in Saint-Denis on the day of the robbery. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the record around it is emotionally charged in ways that make precise reporting difficult. And the precise reporting matters. Hosea was not supposed to be where he was when Agent Andrew Milton shot him. He was functioning as a distraction, a con, in the medium that Hosea had always been most fluent in, designed to draw law enforcement attention away from the bank while the robbery proceeded. A classic Hosea Matthews operation. Low violence, high misdirection, the elegant deployment of performance to create space for the people he cared about to do what they needed to do. Agent Milton was not deceived. Whether Milton had intelligence about the operation in advance, whether Micah Bell, the Pinkerton informant who had been sitting inside the gang for the better part of a year, had communicated the specific details of the Saint Denis plan to his handlers, is not stated with certainty in the accounts that survive. What is stated with certainty is that Milton arrived at the location where Hosea was operating the distraction with a directness that suggested he had not been distracted. He shot Hosea Matthews in a public street, not in a confrontation, not in a gunfight between men who had both chosen the fight. He shot him in the manner of an execution, public, deliberate, a demonstration of power performed for the largest possible audience in the most modern city in the region, on the day that the Van der Linde gang had chosen to make its largest move. Hosea fell. Dutch was on a rooftop when it happened, looking down at the street below, watching his oldest friend, his co-founder, the man who had laughed with him at a campfire on the road to Chicago 25 years earlier, when they had both tried to rob each other and found it funny. Watching him fall in a public while law enforcement closed in from every direction. The account of what Dutch did next is consistent across multiple. He did not go to Hosea. He led the gang in a charge through the city instead, a running fight through the streets of Saint-Denis, desperate and loud, and costing the gang in blood and chaos and the specific damage that comes from fighting through a modern city rather than across open country. John Marston was arrested. Other members were wounded or scattered. The gang that arrived at the Saint-Denis waterfront afterward was a gang that had survived barely and had paid a significant price for the survival. I am not suggesting that going to Hosea would have been possible. Milton and the Pinkertons controlled that street. Hosea was already dead or dying by the time any decision about approaching him could have been made. The practical reality of the situation may well have been that Dutch's charge through the city was the correct decision in the only terms that were available to him: the survival of the people who could still be saved. I am only reporting what the anonymous witness observed. Dutch Van der Linde watched Hosea Matthews die on a street in Saint-Denis and made the decision, in whatever fraction of a second such decisions are made, to keep moving. And what happened to him after that, in the days and weeks that followed, is the evidence I want you to examine carefully. There is a before Hosea and an after Hosea in the record of Dutch Van der Linde. The before Hosea Dutch, however compromised, however far from the man who had handed money to strangers in 1887, still contained within his operating system a functional conscience, not his own conscience necessarily. Hosea's, externalized, imperfect, increasingly overruled, but present. A voice that existed inside the operation rather than outside it, that could access Dutch in moments when the armor was briefly down, that knew how to phrase the concern in the specific language Dutch was still capable of. That voice died on a street in Saint-Denis. What replaced it was not silence. Dutch was not a silent man in the aftermath of Hosea's death. He was, if anything, louder, more certain, more absolute in his declarations that the plan was still intact, that the enemy could still be beaten, that the people who doubted him were failing to see what he could see clearly. But the internal check, the Hosea-shaped, moderating influence that had been losing ground for months and had never fully recovered the authority it once had, but had never entirely disappeared, was gone. And in its absence, what expanded was not Dutch's wisdom or his capability or his genuine strategic vision. What expanded was Micah. Micah Bell moved into the space that Hosea Matthews had vacated with a speed and completeness that, viewed in retrospect, suggests he had been waiting for exactly this vacancy. He became Dutch's primary counsel, his most trusted voice, the person Dutch turned to when a decision needed to be made, and the older, wiser voices, the ones that said wait and slow down, were no longer available. Arthur watched this happen. He did not watch it quietly. He raised it with the directness that Arthur Morgan increasingly deplored as the pretense of diplomatic hesitation became impossible to maintain. He named Micah as a problem. He presented what evidence he had about Micah's reliability and character, he asked Dutch, in terms that were as plain as he knew how to make them, to look at what was happening and to see it clearly. Dutch could not see it or would not. The distinction, and this is the place in the record where the distinction matters most, was becoming by this point genuinely impossible to determine from the outside. Whether Dutch's inability to hear Arthur's concerns about Micah was a failure of perception, the consequence of grief, of the specific blindness that Hosea's death had produced in a man who had lost his most reliable mirror, or whether it was a choice, a deliberate reframing of Arthur's concerns as disloyalty rather than legitimate warning, is the question that the evidence cannot definitively resolve. What the evidence can say is that Dutch chose Micah over Arthur, repeatedly, explicitly, in the specific, observable way that a man chooses when he needs someone to confirm a decision he has already made over someone who is asking him to examine it. This is the 13th piece of evidence, and the weight it adds to the question is considerable. Dutch van der Linde ended up in Guarma. The sequence of events that carried him there, the Saint Denis disaster, the escape to the waterfront, the ship that was supposed to carry surviving gang members to safety, and instead delivered them to a Caribbean island controlled by a sugar baron's private army, has the quality of a bad dream, the specific, grinding absurdity of a situation that keeps getting worse in ways that no plan could have anticipated, that punish the people inside it for crimes they committed and for circumstances entirely outside their control simultaneously. Guarma was Dutch's lowest point geographically, an island he had never intended to visit, under a regime he had no personal quarrel with, fighting a war that was not his war, for people he had arrived among accidentally and would leave without ceremony once a way out presented itself. And yet, in Guarma, Dutch van der Linde did something that the evidence requires me to report honestly, however complicated it is to incorporate into the larger picture. He fought for the rebels, not strategically, not as a calculated deployment of the gang's capabilities in exchange for resources or passage. He fought alongside people who were being oppressed by a man with private military power and no accountability to any law or institution. He engaged with their struggle as though it mattered in itself, as though the people of Guarma, who owed him nothing and from whom he could extract nothing that could not be taken more efficiently by other means, deserved the same response that the people on the roadsides of 1880-something America had deserved. He was, in Guarma, briefly, again, something of the man who had gone into the hovels and the orphanages of the 1887 frontier town. I report this not to rescue the narrative of Dutch van der Linde from what surrounds it. I report it because the anonymous witness reports what he observes, and what he observed in Guarma was a man who was not, even at this late and damaged stage of his history, entirely consistent in his villainy. He was still capable of the other thing, still capable of looking at people being crushed by power they had not chosen, and responding with something that looked, from a certain angle, like the genuine instinct of a man who had once built a community from the discarded. That instinct was not gone. It was simply no longer the primary force operating in Dutch van der Linde's decisions by the time they returned to the mainland. It was a remnant, a fragment, the last piece of the original architecture, still standing inside a structure that had been fundamentally reorganized around different principles, but it was there, and I find I cannot honestly omit it. They came back to the mainland and found their camp at Beaver Hollow. The gang that reassembled at Beaver Hollow was not the gang that had existed before Blackwater. It was smaller. It was fractured along lines of loyalty that had become impossible to conceal. Those who still believed in Dutch, or needed to believe in Dutch, arranged on one side. Those whose faith had been sufficiently tested that they were operating now on the best base of habit and obligation, rather than genuine conviction arranged on the other. Micah Bell was the axis around which the fracture organized itself. Not because Micah was powerful in his own right. He was not. He had the cunning of a man who understands how to insert himself into the space between a leader and his doubts, but he did not have the capability or the character that would have made him a credible alternative center of gravity. The gang did not follow Micah. They followed Dutch, and Micah followed Dutch. And because Micah followed Dutch without friction or qualification, or the occasional terrible honesty that Hosea and Arthur brought to their following, because Micah was the perfect follower, frictionless, confirmatory, always positioned behind whatever Dutch had already decided, Dutch trusted him more than he trusted the people who had been with him for decades. Arthur Morgan was dying. Tuberculosis, contracted in the course of operations, the disease of the poor and the confined and the overworked, the disease that the 19th century distributed with democratic indifference to anyone whose circumstances placed them in sufficient proximity to it. Arthur had been coughing for weeks before the confirmation came. He had known, in the way that the body knows things before the mind will admit them, that something was wrong, that the coughing was not a temporary condition, that the weight he was losing was not coming back. The diagnosis, when it came, arrived with the specific cruelty of a door closing, not immediately, not today, but closing. The question was not whether Arthur Morgan was dying. The question was what he would do with the time remaining. What he did was stay, keep riding, keep doing what Dutch's plans required, because there was no version of himself that he had yet found that existed outside the doing of what Dutch required. The habit of 20 years does not dissolve at a diagnosis. The loyalty, compromised, doubting, increasingly strained, does not simply end because the body that carries it has received a verdict. He stayed, he rode, he coughed, and Dutch van der Linde, who had built Arthur Morgan from a 14-year-old boy in circumstances that would have killed him if someone had not intervened. Dutch watched Arthur coughing and made a choice that the record documents with a clarity that makes it difficult to look at directly. He used him. He continued to deploy Arthur on operations that were dangerous and physically punishing for a man in full health, let alone a man dying of tuberculosis. He continued to send him out, continued to require of him the enforcer's work. And when Arthur's coughing became audible in conversations, when the physical evidence of what was happening to him became impossible to ignore, Dutch did not, by any account the record preserves, stop to sit with Arthur the way Dutch had once sat with a 14-year-old learning to read, did not offer the patience he had once offered without calculation, did not treat Arthur's mortality with the care that 20 years of being the closest thing to a father should have demanded. He used him until he could not use him anymore, and then he let Micah have him. The evidence for Micah Bell's role as a Pinkerton informant reached Dutch van der Linde in the final days of the Beaver Hollow camp. It came from Arthur, specifically, directly, with the urgency of a man who understood that his remaining time was limited and that the most important thing he could do with that time was put this specific truth in front of the specific person who needed to hear it. Micah Bell had been feeding information to the Pinkerton, the ambushes that had seemed too perfectly timed, the positions that law enforcement had arrived at with a specificity that suggested prior knowledge, the sense, growing across the months of 1899, that the gang was being hunted not merely with the ordinary institutional resources of law enforcement, but with the particular efficiency of someone on the inside, providing directions. Micah Bell was that someone. Arthur laid it out. He made the case with the directness of a man who no longer had the luxury of diplomatic approach. He asked Dutch to see what was in front of him. Dutch van der Linde looked at the evidence that Arthur Morgan, his enforcer, the boy he had built, the man who had been with him for 20 years through everything the record contains, had placed before him, and he walked away. He did not confront Micah, did not investigate, did not apply to the question of Micah's loyalty the rigorous examination he had once applied to everything, the reading of situations, the identification of where real power resided, the capacity to see past what people presented toward what they actually were. He walked away. The explanation that Dutch offered in the fragments of dialogue the record has preserved from this confrontation was framed in terms of Arthur's own reliability. Arthur was sick. Arthur was losing his capacity for clear judgment. Arthur was, in the specific vocabulary that Dutch had developed for processing challenges to his authority, failing him, drifting from what was right, no longer capable of the faith that the situation required. I want to be precise about what this meant. Dutch van der Linde, that confronted with trusted most in his camp, had been systematically betraying everyone in it, had been the mechanism of Blackwater, of the ambushes, of Hosea's death on the street in Saint-Denis, chose to reframe the evidence as the failure of the person rather than the failure of the person it described. He chose Micah over Arthur, over 20 years, over the boy he had taught to read. The question we have been carrying arrives at Beaver Hollow, at the place where it comes closest to resolving, not because the evidence is finally sufficient to answer it definitively. It is not. The question is constructed in a way that cannot be definitively answered, and I have been honest about that from the beginning of this long night. But the weight, by Beaver Hollow, has shifted so far in one direction that holding the scales level requires a deliberate effort that the evidence no longer honestly support. A man who chooses, in full possession of the relevant information, to disbelieve the testimony of 20 years in favor of the flattery of 5 months, who allows the person who built him to die on a mountainside while the person who betrayed him walks free, is not a man still in the process of becoming the monster. He is the monster, functional, present, making decisions with clear eyes and a voice that still carries the cadences of the philosophy and the firelight readings and the 22 years of building something from nothing. But the thing being protected by those cadences is no longer the thing they were built to protect. The thing being protected is Dutch van der Linde's belief in Dutch van der Linde. Nothing else. Not the gang. The gang was fracturing beyond repair. Not the philosophy. The philosophy had been violated in every specific particular it had ever articulated. Not the people. Arthur was dying, and Dutch had just walked away from the one action that could have honored 20 years of what Arthur had given him. Only the belief, only the absolute certainty that Dutch van der Linde had always been right, was still right, would be right about everything if the people around him would simply maintain their faith for a little longer. Arthur Morgan did not maintain his faith. He held Micah at gunpoint at the Beaver Hollow camp. There was a confrontation, not the clean resolution the confrontation deserved, but the messy, incomplete, interrupted version that real confrontations tend to produce when the authority that should adjudicate them has already made its choice. Dutch intervened. He broke up the fight. He looked at Arthur Morgan, the boy he had found on a roadside in the 1870s, the man he had built from nothing, the person who had given 20 years of absolute capability and absolute loyalty to a vision that Dutch had been progressively betraying for longer than either of them wanted to count, and he turned away. He walked out of the Beaver Hollow camp, and Arthur Morgan, alone, having just watched the man who was the closest thing to a father he had ever known choose the informant over him, was left with Micah Bell. The record of what followed belongs to Arthur Morgan, not to Dutch van der Linde. It is Arthur's story. It is Arthur's death. The specifics of it, the fight, the mountainside, the sunrise that Arthur faced at the end, rather than the setting sun in the west, belong in a different broadcast, on a different long night, for a different chapter of this world. What belongs here is only this. Dutch van der Linde walked away, and that walk, that specific, deliberate, chosen turning of the back on the most faithful person in his life, is the 14th piece of evidence. It is the heaviest in the record, heavier than Heidi McCourt, heavier than Molly O'Shea, heavier than the WAP-PT manipulation, heavier than the hidden money, heavier than every piece of evidence that has accumulated across this long night on the side of the scale that argues monster rather than man. Because all of those things could be explained, partly, imperfectly, with the particular moral gymnastics that Dutch van der Linde had been performing on his own behalf for years. The pressure, the paranoia, the grief, the impossible situation, the world closing in from every direction, the specific damage that living outside the law for 22 years produces in a person, the way it hollows out certain capabilities and hypertrophies others until the person who remains is not quite the person who began. All of that could be argued, and some of it had genuine force. But Arthur Morgan on the mountainside cannot be argued, cannot be framed differently, cannot be incorporated into the philosophy of the man who taught him to read and found in it anything other than the full and final proof that the philosophy was gone. Dutch walked away, and the question, was he always the monster, or did the world make him one, does not resolve itself into a clean answer even here. It arrives instead at a place that is more honest than resolution. The world did make him. The absent government that took him, the 15 years on the road, the Annabelle grief, the Blackwater pressure, the Hosea absence, all of it is real and all of it is part of the record, and none of it can be honestly set aside. And he walked away from Arthur Morgan on a mountainside. Both of those things are true. Both of them are the record. Both of them are Dutch Verlinde, the Wapiti Indians. I have not yet addressed them at the length they deserve, and the chapter is reaching its natural end. So, I will address them briefly here and carry the rest into what follows. Eagle Flies was the son of Chief Rain's Fall, young, brilliant, furious with a fury that was entirely justified. The fury of a man watching his people's land be consumed by the same machinery that had consumed everything else in the path of the American expansion. The fury of someone who has been told, repeatedly and with increasing specificity, that the institutions that claimed to protect him had no intention of doing so. Dutch van der Linde recognized that fury. He understood it, had built a 22-year career on the same recognition that the institutions were not what they claimed to be, that the people they most clearly failed had the most legitimate reason to oppose them. He used Eagle Fly not to help the Wapiti, not to honor the philosophy that had claimed, for 2 decades, to stand on the side of the excluded against the powerful. He pointed Eagle Fly's legitimate fury at the United States Army because the United States Army's attention on the Wapiti in that specific moment was useful to Dutch van der Linde's escape plan. Eagle Flies died. The Wapiti were not liberated. The land was not returned. The fury that Dutch recognized and weaponized for his own purposes spent itself against a military force that it could not overcome, and the young man who carried it paid with his life for the privilege of being to a man who had already walked away from Arthur Morgan. Dutch watched and moved on. This is the 15th piece of evidence, and the night, though it is later now than it was when we began, is not yet finished. The cliff is still ahead. There is a newspaper, published in 1907, a small item buried in the regional news. Not a headline, not a feature, not the kind of reporting that gets remembered. A brief mention, the sort that local papers print when something unusual has been observed in the surrounding country and the editor judges it worth 3 sentences and no follow-up. The item reports a sighting. Dutch van der Linde, the paper says, has been seen in the tall trees area. Not confirmed, not verified. A sighting, the kind of thing famous enough for long enough that the public imagination continues to produce him in the landscape, even after the reasonable assumption would be that he is gone. The kind of sighting that accumulates around certain figures. Outlaws, disappeared persons, people whose endings were not witnessed with sufficient clarity to settle the question of whether the ending was real. There had also been a report, somewhere in the years between 1899 and 1907, that Dutch van der Linde had died in a fire following a bungled robbery in 1906. The report was specific enough to be plausible, specific enough that some of the people who had known him, who had ridden with him, who had organized years of their lives around his vision, may have allowed themselves to believe it, to close the account, to accept that the man was gone and that, whatever they felt about him, Whatever remained unresolved between what he had been and what he had could be laid down now alongside him. The newspaper item in 1907 suggested that the account was not closed, and the newspaper item in 1907 was correct. Dutch van der Linde spent the years between 1899 and 1911 as a ghost, not metaphorically. Practically, he moved through those years without the substance that visibility requires, without a fixed location, without a name that could be reliably attached to any action, without the gang that had made him legible to the world for 22. The van der Linde gang was gone. The community was dispersed. The people who had organized themselves around him, who had built their identities and their daily lives and their understanding of what they were doing in the world around the gravity of Dutch van der Linde, had gone in their separate directions. Hosea was dead. Arthur was dead. Susan Grimshaw was dead. She had died at Beaver Hollow, in the collapse, in the chaos that Dutch's final decisions had produced. The living survivors had scattered. Javier Escuela was somewhere in Mexico, eventually captured by the Bureau of Investigation and turned over to John Marston's reluctant pursuit. Bill Williamson had built a small fiefdom in New Austin, the kind of petty criminal territory that a man of Bill's capabilities can construct in an absence of genuine oversight. John Marston had gone to Beecher's Hope with Abigail and Jack, had built a ranch, had attempted the life he had always wanted, and that Dutch had always experienced of abandonment. Tilly Jackson had found her way out. Simon Pearson had a deli somewhere. The people who had survived had, in their various ways, attempted to build something from what remained. Dutch van der Linde, who had given them the vocabulary to believe that a different kind of life was possible, who had built the community from which each of them had learned whatever they knew about loyalty and code, and the specific worth of people the world had discarded. Dutch van der Linde disappeared, not into a better life, not into the Tahiti that had been promised and deferred, and promised again, across the entire arc of 1899, not into farming and simplicity, and the savage utopia that Evelyn Miller's books had given him the language for, into Micah Bell. The exact nature of what Dutch and Micah were to each other in the years between 1907 and the epilogue's events is not fully documented in the record. What the record shows is the result. When John Marston, Sadie Adler, and Charles Smith tracked Micah Bell to his hideout in the mountains in 1907, 8 years after Blackwater, 8 years after Arthur Morgan died on a mountainside, 8 years after Dutch van der Linde walked out of a camp and did not look back, they found Dutch there, with Micah, with the $150,000 from the Blackwater ferry, the money that had been hidden near Blackwater since April of 1899, the money that had not been distributed to the gang when the gang was alive, the money that had not been used to fund the Tahiti plan, or any other version of the escape that had been promised so many times to so many people, the money that had stayed hidden while Davy Callender and Jenny Kirk were buried in frozen ground, and Mac Callender was killed in Pinkerton custody, and Hosea Matthews was shot in a public street, and Arthur Morgan died on a mountainside. The money that Dutch had. I said earlier in this broadcast that I would not tell you what to conclude from the detail of the money staying hidden, that I would report it and let you draw your own conclusions. I maintain that position. The anonymous witness does not adjudicate, he reports. But I will note, because the record requires the noting, that in 1907, 8 years after Blackwater, the money was in Dutch van der Linde's possession, in a mountain hideout, with Micah Bell. Draw what conclusions the evidence supports. There is a standoff. John Marston and Sadie Adler and Charles Smith arrive at the hideout. The standoff develops in the way that such situations develop, quickly, with the specific compression of time that occurs when multiple armed people occupy a small space and the air between them is full of everything that has not yet been said and everything that cannot be unsaid. Micah Bell holds Sadie hostage. John faces Micah. Charles is wounded. The geometry of the situation is the geometry of a final scene. Everyone in position. no clean exits. The resolution is dependent on a decision that has not yet been made by the person who still has the capacity to make it. Dutch van der Linde steps out of a cabin. The record of what passes between Dutch and John Marston in this moment is not extensive. The standoff does not produce the long conversation that the accumulated history between them would seem to demand. What it produces is a brief, weighted exchange. Two men who had been father and son in everything except the legal documentation of standing in a mountain clearing 8 years after everything ended, with Micah Bell in the geometry between them. Dutch shot Micah, not John, not Sadie, not himself, not yet. That ending was still 12 years away on a different mountain. He shot Micah Bell in the chest, mortally. The man who had been his most trusted counsel, the man he had chosen over Arthur Morgan, the man he had chosen over 20 years of everything the record. He shot him. And then he looked at John Marston, the boy he had saved from a hanging in Illinois in 1885, the son who had left and come back and been trusted with diminishing completeness ever since. And he left the Blackwater money on the ground between them and walked away, without a word that the record has preserved, without an explanation, without the speeches that had characterized every other significant moment in his life. The philosophy invoked, the plan reasserted, the faith requested. He walked away in silence and disappeared again into the mountains. I have thought about that silence more than almost anything else in this story. Dutch van der Linde was not a silent man. He was, by every account the record preserves, one of the most verbally capable people in any room he entered. He had built a 22-year career, partly on the extraordinary instrument of his own voice. Its authority, its conviction, its ability to make whatever he was currently saying feel like the only reasonable thing that could be said. Words were how Dutch operated in the world. Words were how he built the gang, maintained it, justified its actions, framed its disasters as temporary setbacks, asked for faith past the point where faith was honestly warranted. In the mountain clearing in 1907, with the man he had chosen over everyone else bleeding out in front of him, and the man he had abandoned standing across from him, he said nothing, or nothing the record has preserved. What does the silence mean? The anonymous witness offers no interpretation, only the observation. A man who had a speech for everything had nothing to say in the clearing where it ended, whatever that means, whether it was the first genuine speechlessness of Dutch van der Linde's life, the moment when the mechanism finally failed, when there was no framing available that the situation would bear. I leave with you. The years between 1907 and 1911 are the thinnest in the record. Dutch van der Linde moved through them without leaving much behind. He was alive. The subsequent events confirm that definitively. He was somewhere in the Western Territories, moving, not settling, not building anything that could be built. The man who had spent 22 years constructing a community, gathering people from roadsides and teaching them to read and organizing their lives around a shared vision, was, in these years, apparently constructing nothing. What we know of these years comes primarily from what Dutch did with them eventually. He found the wapiti, not the wapiti of the 1899 story, not rains fall and eagle flies, who were gone by their own separate routes, a different generation. Young men who had inherited the legitimate grievance without the specific leaders who had tried to navigate it. Young men who were angry in the way that young men are angry, when the structures of their world have been systematically dismantled, and the institutions responsible for the dismantling continue to present themselves as protection rather than threat. Dutch van der Linde recognized that anger. He had always recognized it. It was the anger he had organized his own life around since 15 years old on the outskirts of Philadelphia. It was the anger he had, at his best, channeled into something that offered genuine shelter to genuine people. It was also, at his worst, the anger he had used as a resource, as fuel for operations that served his purposes, rather than the purposes of the people whose anger it was. He built another gang, not from the discarded this time, not from the orphaned and the excluded and the people sleeping rough on roadsides, from the angry, from young men whose fury at a government that had taken their land and their future and their self-determination made them willing to follow a man who told them their fury was correct. Their fury was correct. Dutch's use of it was not. He directed them against settlers outside of Blackwater, against targets that had no specific connection to the institutional machinery that had actually destroyed the Wapitis world, but that were proximate and vulnerable and available. The Bureau of Investigation, tracking the murders of 2 men on a homestead north of Blackwater in November of 1911, identified Dutch van der Linde as the responsible party and sent John Marston to find him. John Marston, who had built a ranch at Beecher's Hope, who had a wife and a son and the life he had always wanted, who had been promised by the Bureau of Investigation that hunting down the remaining members of the van der Linde gang would purchase his family's safety, who had already given them Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela, and was now being asked to give them the last one, the man who had saved him from a hanging in Illinois in 1885. Cochinay, Dutch van der Linde's final stronghold, sat in the highest mountains of the Tall Trees region, a fort built at an elevation that made approach difficult, that required anyone coming for him to come in force and come prepared and come willing to fight through the men he had placed between himself and the world below. He had always chosen the high ground, literally in this final redoubt, but also in the figurative sense that had characterized his entire relationship with authority and opposition. Dutch van der Linde never positioned himself as a man who had failed to live up to his own standards. He was always, in his own understanding, on the high ground, morally, philosophically, in terms of the genuine justice of his position relative to the government and the industrialists and the Bureau of Investigation that had sent John Marston up the mountain to find him. He was on the high ground, the mountain confirmed it. The Bureau of Investigation arrived in force. The United States Army arrived. John Marston arrived. The assault on Cochinay had the quality of a formal ending. The full weight of the institutional machinery that Dutch van der Linde had spent his entire life opposing brought to bear on the last position he held. His men fell, one by one, in the specific arithmetic of an unwinnable fight. The young Wapiti men who had organized their anger around his presence paid the price that men pay when they follow someone a position that cannot be defended. Dutch moved through the falling of them without the specific grief that Hosea's death had produced in him, without the visible devastation that had followed the deaths at Blackwater. He moved through it with the abstracted quality of a man who has been in this situation enough times that the individual losses have become, in some terrible way, acceptable. He had always had another plan. He moved through the fort, through the caves beneath it, the same caves where a well-stocked bookshelf had been found, where a typewriter had been found, where the evidence of a continued interior life existed alongside the evidence of a man directing violence at settlers from a mountain redoubt. The books and the typewriter still present, still Dutch van der Linde even here, still the man who read. He came out onto the cliff. John Marston was waiting. The 2 men faced each other on the edge of a mountain in November of 1911. Between them was everything the record contains. 1885 and the Illinois hanging. 22 years of the van der Linde gang. Blackwater and St. Denis and Guarma and Beaver Hollow. Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews and Annabelle and Molly O'Shea and Heidi McCourt. The $150,000 and the Tahiti dream and every speech Dutch had ever given, asking for faith past the point where faith was warranted. Between them was all of it, and Dutch van der Linde spoke. He did not speak at length. He did not produce the extended philosophical address that the situation might have seemed to call for. The full deployment of the voice that had moved 23 people to organize their lives around a shared vision. He spoke with the specific economy of a man who has perhaps for the first time, in a very long life of speaking, arrived at a place where the words are not going to help. He spoke about nature. He said that he had spent his whole life fighting the government, fighting the law, fighting the closing frontier, fighting the industrial machine, and the Pinkertons, and the Bureau of Investigation, and every other form that the machinery of power had taken in his lifetime. He had fought all of it. He could not stop. And then he said something more difficult. He said he could not fight his own nature either. That was the paradox. He could not fight the world that was destroying everything he believed in. And he could not stop fighting, because fighting was what he was, had always been what he was, would be what he was, until there was nothing left of him that could still lift its arms against anything. He could not fight his own nature. He called himself a monster, not in the specific moral vocabulary of a man performing contrition, not as an apology, not as an accounting offered to the person standing across from him, as an observation, a factual statement about what the record supports, delivered by the one person in the world who had access to the complete interior version of the record and had arrived. Finally, at the conclusion, the exterior version had been suggesting for years he was the monster. He had been the monster. He did not know, standing on that cliff, whether he had always been the monster or whether something in the world had made him one. He did not offer a resolution to the question we have been carrying. He offered only the paradox, the inability to fight and the inability to stop fighting, held simultaneously in a man who was standing at the edge of a mountain with nowhere left to go. John Marston said, "Then I have to shoot you." Dutch, our time has passed, John, and stepped backward off the cliff. He fell. The record does not describe the fall in detail. It describes the result. Dutch van der Linde at the bottom, dead. The long argument of his life concluded by a step taken voluntarily backward into the air above a mountain in November of 1911. He did not wait for John to shoot. He did not surrender to the Bureau of Investigation. He did not allow the machinery he had spent his entire life opposing to administer his ending. He took the ending himself, in the one remaining act of self-determination available to him at cliff. The choice of the manner and the moment, he exercised it. Edgar Ross arrived, looked at the body, asked John for his gun, fired a shot into the already dead man so that the report would read correctly, said, with the specific contempt of a man who has never had to account for his own actions in any serious way, that it looked better that way. Dutch had said, in his final words, that when he was gone, they would find another monster, another target to pursue, another figure to organize the Bureau's resources around, to justify its wages and its authority and its institutional existence. He was right. They found John Marston almost immediately. The prophecy completed itself with the efficiency of a mechanism that had been running for years and required no particular intelligence to operate, only the continued existence of a system that needed enemies to justify itself and would always find them, because the alternative was accountability. John Marston died in 1911, not long after Cucine. Jack Marston, who had been the baby that Dutch helped rescue from the Braithwaites, who had grown up in the shadow of everything this record contains, hunted down Edgar Ross in 1914 and killed him. The cycle that Dutch van der Linde had described on the cliff, the cycle of power producing monsters and using them to justify further power endlessly without resolution, completed one full rotation in the 3 years after his death. He was right about the system. He was always right about the system. He was also the man who shot Heidi McCourt and walked away from Arthur Morgan and used eagle flies as a pawn and kept $150,000 hidden while the people who trusted him scattered into their separate survivals. Both things are true. Both things are the record. There is a book in a canvas tent in an abandoned camp somewhere in the American wilderness. The camp is gone now. The tent is gone. The people who lived in it have dispersed or died in the various ways that the record has documented across this long night. But the book existed, and what was written in it existed, and a man read it by firelight for years and tried, genuinely tried, with whatever was genuine in him, to build a world that honored what it said. The real America, Evelyn Miller wrote, can only be found not in desires, but in the purity of its landscape. Dutch van der Linde believed that, in the years when belief was still connected to action in the way that integrity requires, when what he said and what he did were pointing in the same direction, he lived it as fully as anyone, living outside the law, in the 1880s could live a philosophical conviction, and then the desires accumulated. The desire to be right, to be trusted, to be followed without question. The desire to maintain the authority that the community had built around him. The desire to protect at any cost the image of Dutch van der Linde as a man whose vision was correct and whose judgment was sound, and whose plan, however deferred, however revised, however detached from any specific details that could be examined and questioned, whose plan would eventually deliver everyone to the life they had been promised. The desires accumulated, the landscape, the purity of it, the honest demand it makes of anyone who actually stands in it, rather than describing it from a campfire, receded. And what remained in the end, on a cliff in November of 1911, was a man who knew the distance between what he had meant to be and what he had become was too large to close, and who chose, in the last act of genuine self-knowledge available to him, to step into it, rather than continue pretending it was not there. The question, was Dutch van der Linde always the monster, or did the world make him one? I have carried it with you through this entire long night, through the Philadelphia outskirts, and the road to Chicago, and the campfire, where two men tried to rob each other and laughed, through the orphaned boys taught to read by firelight, and the money handed to strangers in the streets of an 1887 frontier town, through Annabelle's death and the blood feud it ignited, and the 22 years of bank robberies and the philosophy built from real books by real thinkers, asking real questions about a real injustice, through Blackwater, through Heidi McCourt, through Hosea falling in Saint Denis and Micah, standing in the space that Hosea left, and Arthur coughing on a mountainside, while Dutch used him for what remained of his usefulness, through the silence in the clearing, where Dutch shot Micah and left the money for John, and walked back into the mountains without a word, through the cliff. The honest answer, the one the anonymous witness offers, having stood in all of those places and reported what he observed, is that the question cannot be resolved into a single statement without losing something essential. The world made him, specifically, documentably, in ways the record supports at every stage. The absent father consumed by the government, the mother learned of dead from a stranger, 15 years building a self from nothing on a road that offered only what you could take from it. Annabelle, Hosea, the pressure that 22 years of living outside the law applies to a man's capacity for genuine self-examination, and he was always within him, the man who would eventually stand on that cliff. The man capable of Heidi McCourt was present before Blackwater. The man capable of walking away from Arthur was present before Beaver Hollow. The man who could watch Molly O'Shea be shot without lifting a word in her defense. He was there, in some form, in the years when he was also handing money to strangers in frontier streets and scolding his enforcer for stealing from the poor. The saint and the monster inhabited the same body from the beginning. What changed across the years this record covers was not the presence of either one. What changed was the balance of power between them. The slow, grinding, grief-assisted, Micah-accelerated, paranoia-fueled shift in which of the two occupied the foreground of Dutch van der Linde's daily decisions. The world did not create the monster. The world created the conditions under which the monster could grow large enough to crowd out everything else. That is the distinction. It is not a clean one. It does not resolve the question into the satisfying answer that questions, held across 4 hours in the dark, perhaps deserve, but it is the honest one. And the honest one is what the anonymous witness offers, having been in all of those places and seen all of those things and reported them as plainly as they can be reported. Dutch van der Linde was both men, always. The world determined which one won. And so the story rests here, friend. If it stayed with you, if the question still open somewhere in the quiet of where you are right now, still turning over without resolution, still heavier than when we picked it up together at the beginning of this long night, Then leave a small note below. Tell me which man you found in the record, the saint, or the monster, or the thing that is harder to name than either. I will be here again, with another life, another long night, another quiet hour. Until then, this has been Mr. K-Law. Sleep well.